Hey guys, welcome back. In the first time startup video, I discovered that my O2 sensor was bad. It appeared to be a dead heater circuit because it registered a small amount of fuel, but no amount of fuel that I added to it with the ECU would change its O2 readings. Then we had a foreshadowing moment where I showed the box for my Innovate LC2 Wideband sensor kit. Originally I wanted to install it in addition to my factory O2 sensor, but the best laid plans of mice and men often go awry. Because of my immediate need to have an inspection sticker, and because others have proven that the wideband works just fine in the factory O2 housing location on a DSM, I'll be installing my wideband in place of my factory sensor, and simulating the narrowband signal using ECMlink. This simplifies the installation of the sensor in the exhaust system, but it certainly doesn't make things easier on myself from a service perspective. In order to calibrate the sensor, you'll need to periodically remove it from the exhaust. On this car, removing the O2 sensor requires removing the intercooler piping, the power steering pump, belt, and bracket, and then you can access it with a series of extensions. This is the wideband lambda sensor taking its place. We can't hook this thing up right now though because it has to be disconnected for its calibration. But we need to find a home for everything else in the box that came with it. In the autometer gauge video, you saw me struggle with a crappy 120 volt soldering iron. This is the Power Probe butane soldering kit. I used one of these a decade ago and it ruined me. Charge it with a superior grade butane and you get an hour and a half of cordless instant soldering power, complete with a torch exhaust vent that makes short work of heat shrink tubing. It's hot enough to melt solder within only seconds, and it does this anywhere I ever need to use it. I also picked up a brass tip cleaner because the wet sponge method lends itself to tip oxidation and corrosion. I'll be soldering things all my life, so my life just got easier. There are other brands and models available that'll do the same thing, but this particular kit can be had for under 50 bucks. Also today, I'm finally getting a chance to use my WeatherPack pen tool kit. And before I even begin, I go and bend one of these things. That was intentional. I don't know why I just removed the LC2 wideband cable from the shot yet, because I'm not done putting all my tools down to say that these are all the things we're going to use. Some extra wire, some bullet connectors, pliers, a soldering iron, tip cleaner, magnifier, instructions, and oh yeah, strippers. Every wiring job is more fun with strippers. But let me show you what comes in the kit. You get a tiny pair of wrenches for taking off the tiny little accessory tips. You get a torch, a hot knife, a single cut tip, a double cut tip, a reflector, and a dehydrated sponge tip cleaner. Just add water. Oh, and a tube of solder. It costs 4 times as much as the one at Radio Shack, but Radio Shack is out of business anyway, so you might as well pay Amazon a visit. Only trick is, you have to use Vector gas for these things, and $20 worth of refills will probably last a Weekend Warrior a lifetime. I'm going to start with making some pigtail connectors to solder the ECU pins where I'll need to interface my wideband to the ECU. I only want to interface it on 2 pins, the number 4 O2 signal wire pin and the ECU ground pin, number 106. That's for a 1G ECU using ECMlink. If you have a different year ECU, verify which pins you should use, but on my car it's number 4 and number 106. I'm trying to be stealth and tidy about it. Short wires with female bullet connectors crimped and shrink tubed onto 14 gauge wires with just enough length to allow me to make my connections. Next I'm going to make a pair of extensions with the male end of the bullet connectors soldered on in a desperate attempt to ensure good contact. I need one for the O2 signal and one for the ground. One of the wires on the LC2 controller box, the brown wire, will not be used, so I cut the stripped end off, wrapped it in electrical tape to insulate it, and that's that. I'll show you the 3 other wires in a minute. I bought the kit that comes with a red LED gauge, and I want to incorporate this into my install as well. The instructions say to install the controller and then install the gauge, but I don't listen. I'm doing it all at the same time and it will work out fine, you just have to pay attention to what you're doing. Kill the main power or disconnect the battery and then unplug your ECU connectors to allow better access to the wiring. In order to make the best possible connection here, I want to first remove the pin and the wire connected to the number 4 pin on the ECU. First you remove the insulating retainer from the front of the connector, and it gives you access to the plastic tabs that hold the ECU pins in. Reach in with your tool and pry up the plastic retainer in the center of the connector, and then pull the pin out the back of it. With it removed, it's much easier to strip, solder, and insulate the pigtails I made onto this connector pin. In order to be as neat as I can here, first I want to strip back the insulation from the connector pin just enough to firmly attach one of my pigtails to it, and then solder it in place. The price versus convenience of not having to run an extension cord into my car and wait 15 minutes for a soldering iron to heat up Just paid for this soldering iron 6 times over. I use heat shrink tubing to insulate my work, and I don't even have to change tools. I'm sorry I didn't do a better job of keeping that in the shot. You can take my word for it. I'm about to do it again on the ground wire in a second, so I'll get that one right for you. For the ground pin, we have to do the same thing. I said 106 earlier, and really the pin I'm using here is 101 on the small connector, but 101 and 106 are both ground wires on a 1G ECU. They're two of the same thing. You can use either one. Strip, solder, shrink tube, and then reinsert it back into the plug. Now I can easily attach the wideband controller to my ECU with the harness extensions that we made earlier. If I ever need to remove the wideband from my ECU, I can easily just unplug the bullet connectors and plug in a factory O2 sensor. Don't do it like this and then connect both sensors. It won't damage anything, but it makes both signals useless. The dash needs to come apart next. I want to install my wideband controller somewhere out of sight. I have to run the wideband O2 sensor cable through the firewall and over to the controller box, so I'm mounting the box first to see where the cables all have to go and how long my wiring extensions will need to be. The controller box has these neat new screw holes on all four corners to mount it securely with the LC2. But there's nothing I can screw it to inside this dashboard, so I'm just going to use zip ties anyway. No fancy custom welded brackets today, sorry YouTubes. With that mounted, now I can pull the O2 sensor cable through the firewall. It's a larger cable, and I'm going to use the same exact location as I did for the oil pressure, coolant temperature gauge, and ground wires to come through the firewall, so I'm going to take some precautions to keep from cutting those. I'm using the same long drill bit, but I'm going to put 2 rubber vacuum caps on it, tape the thick cable behind the caps with electrical tape, and then use some multi-purpose grease to show a little mercy on that shifter grommet. After the small end of the cable goes through the firewall, I'm able to thread the big end over to where I'll need to make my connection to the O2 sensor, and then back into the interior to plug the O2 harness into the controller box. Now that I know the O2 sensor cable can reach the devices on both of its ends, it can be secured out of the way. It's at this stage where we've actually done all the hard work. The rest is just hooking up the bits and pieces that I cobbled together and connecting them to the right wires of the controller box. I plug in the O2 signal connector to pin 4 and the ground to 106. I used yellow for the signal wire because that's what the controller uses, and black for ground. To connect power, I'm running a 14 gauge red extension wire to the center console where I mounted the main 12 volt relay 2 videos ago. Now I just need to solder these 3 connections for the controller. But I mentioned earlier that I'm adding the DB digital gauge to get direct feedback from the driver's seat at all times. I said I wasn't following step 1 for the gauge, and there it is. I'm installing both components at once. Well, the gauge has 4 wires to install, and 3 of those wires can be soldered to the connections for the LC2 controller. According to these instructions, 2 of them absolutely have to be. 1 is optional, and the 4th wire must either go to a headlight circuit or to the ground. So if you're not going to utilize the dimmer circuitry, it needs to be grounded, so in reality all 4 of these wires could be soldered to these extensions. Where they try to confuse you here is with the wire colors of the signal wires. The gauge's O2 signal wire is a white wire, and the illumination signal for the gauge is its yellow wire. Unfortunately, you can't use your car's dimmer circuit for illumination because it will cause the gauge to malfunction. So I'm using my light switch circuit on my steering column. There are 3 connectors on my car's steering column, and to find out the right one, I'm just disconnecting them one at a time until my headlight switch stops turning the headlights on and off. Nope, that was my turbo timer, I think. But anyway, this is a process of elimination means of locating the circuit I'm looking for. Once I find the right connector, I plug it all back together and then back probe that connector with a plain old 12 volt test light to find the right pin. The instructions say to make sure it's a 12 volt source, so I'm using a multimeter once I find the right pin to verify that this circuit will work. That one looks like the right one. It won't dim when the parking lights are on, but it'll dim once the headlights are on. I'm happy with that, and that all looks good. Adding the illumination circuit to the steering column connector is pretty much the same thing here as the ECU connectors. I don't want to disturb the lighting circuit, so I'm just going to strip back the insulation from the wire that's there and then add a length of wire to the pin to run over to where all my other wideband connections are. The gauge's yellow wire is the illumination wire, and that's why I'm using the yellow wire here again. Yellow wires everywhere. At least when I find a yellow wire here under the dash, I'll know it's for the wideband. Although I confess I'm getting a little bit lazy here. I should have added a bullet connector to be consistent in case I ever want to remove it, but I can always cut that wire when I remove it and just install one if I ever put it back. Easy enough. Putting it back together is also exactly the same, except that there's no retaining clip on the front of that connector. That's the last wire needed in order to connect the gauge. But before we go any further, I need somewhere to put the gauge. In this car, the goal is function over form. That should be plenty obvious by now and from every angle that you view it. The bottom left corner of my console below the coolant temperature gauge doesn't have any warning or signal lights, so that's the perfect location for this car. If I ever want to go stealth mode, I can just disconnect the harness and pull the gauge out. Although it's fairly stealth here rather than a pillar pod anyway, so that's where it goes. Both of the harnesses from these components are black wire loomed tubes with 4 wires coming out, so pay attention to which one is which. The LC2 controller box has a brown wire attached to it, and the gauge doesn't. We want to start by twisting the power and ground wires together. These are the only 2 wires from these components where the colors actually match up. Once we've got these twisted up good and tight, you want to twist the white wire from the gauge to the yellow wire on the controller box. Remember that the brown wire remains unused for this installation method. It's the analog narrowband signal, and I'll be simulating the narrowband signal with ECMlink, and that's why we don't need it. The yellow illumination wire from the gauge goes to the yellow extension from the steering column. But I always start with the ground wires whenever I'm doing a wiring job, so the first order of business for me is to twist the wideband system's black wires to the black extension wire connected to the ECU ground. Don't forget your shrink tubing. I always do that. And daggone it, it's frustrating. Slide the shrink tubing far enough from where you're working that it doesn't shrink from the heat of your soldering work. Twist the wires together, solder, and then shrink. This is always the right way to make connections in automotive environments because they don't work themselves loose and they don't get shorted to other circuits this way. If you don't have your wires insulated properly, you can damage electrical circuits or introduce radio frequency interference. None of these things are good for your wideband signal. Once the ground wire is soldered and shrink tubed, it's time for power. Same thing here, I'm just adding the main power extension to the LC2 wideband system's wires. Dang it, almost forgot the shrink tubing again. This power is not plugged into the fused relay wire yet. We'll get there. With the power wire soldered, now I want to attach the white and the yellow O2 signal wires to the extension to pin 4 on the ECU. Finally, our last wire, the illumination wires. If you didn't want to use extension wires to these circuits, you might find, like I did, that there's more than enough wire attached to both the controller box and the gauge to cut the loom free and route the wires to these components over to their proper locations. But my quest to use bullet connectors left me using 14 gauge wire, and I simply coiled up the remaining cables out of sight inside the dash. If I wind up breaking this chassis in half someday, I'll need to be able to do this in another car, so I preserved it. On other cars I might not be so kind. I might make it fit. Previously I told you that I'd skip this part the next time I had to do it, and I lied. I hope that someday I can regain your trust after wasting these 7 seconds of yours. I'm diving back in here again so that I can make my power connection and to install a 5 amp blade fuse in the fuse holder. The wideband controller requires 3 amps of protection, and it recommends a fast acting fuse like a bus fuse. But since I'm also powering the gauge off the same power circuit, I'm using a 5 amp blade fuse just like every other circuit on my car uses. After plugging in my connector, I'm wrapping it in tape just to ensure that it stays together, and so that it can't make contact with another circuit. I didn't do this everywhere else, but it's a good practice whenever you use bullet connectors to do this, especially on power circuits. If your wires get pulled tight, it can pull a bullet connector out and expose bare metal. Now that the 5 amp power circuit is connected to both the gauge and the controller, we're live. You want both devices powered from the same circuit and grounded in the same place. Done and done. All we need now is to plug in the gauge and calibrate the O2 sensor. I'm doing the O2 sensor calibration prior to putting my dashboard back together because I need to see the LED status indicator on the controller box for this process. The sensor needs to be unplugged and completely removed from the exhaust at the beginning of the calibration process. When you power up the controller and it doesn't see the O2 sensor, it resets its previous calibration. So to reset the controller, you just turn the key on and leave the engine off. You'll see it go green during the power on self-test, and then it'll produce a series of 2 short blinks. Keep the key on for at least 30 seconds while these blinks are occurring, and then turn it off. Now go back to the big end of the cable and plug in your O2 sensor, leaving it sitting in open air. For this calibration, you can't have the O2 sensor installed inside the exhaust pipe. It must have open air. Go back to the driver's seat and key on engine off again. This time you'll see it post, and then produce a series of short blinks for roughly 25 seconds. I was slow on the timer here, my bad. I'm about 10 seconds off. Then it'll blink rapidly before going solid green. This indicates that your sensor is calibrated and ready to go. But in my case, the suffering has just begun. Now I need to install the sensor and put my whole power steering system back together. This is all the dimmer does. It's really not much, but I feel better having hooked it up. Alright, stop procrastinating, Jafro, and put your car back together already. I really don't need to see the controller anymore, so I'm buttoning up the dash. You'll want to do all this with the key off, and don't power it back on for any reason until you have everything else in place. You risk resetting the calibration if you do. Unplug and install your wideband O2 sensor. You'll see that Innovate coats the threads of the sensor with anti-seize in advance for you. That's nice of them. But if you were doing a periodic calibration, now would be the wise time to reapply it. I have to admit here, this isn't exactly fun to do on this car. I've read that the LC2 is less picky about its calibration schedule than the LC1 is, but I don't have any first-hand experience with it to confirm or deny that. I just hope that it's true, or else I have no doubts that I'll be making some major changes to the exhaust system. This will be worse for everyone with a 4G63 swapped Hyundai than for anyone with an actual DSM. And it's because the Hyundai frame rails are narrower than any Eclipse. It's all missing from the driver's side where the power steering pump is. I've also got 1.5 inches less room between the front of the engine and the radiator support. Add to that, there's nowhere else that I can route the upper intercooler pipe except right over the top. Headlights, reservoirs, hoses, engine mount. The power steering system is nearly inaccessible on this car, and it's beneath all of that stuff. I'm demonstrating that I wouldn't ask you to do something that I'm not willing to do myself. If you're taking this job on and you're fighting an inconvenient O2 sensor location, I feel your pain, man. You can use any of the 5-volt inputs that aren't already assigned in order to make your connection if you're using ECMlink. You just have to make sure that you tell ECMlink where to look for it once you've done it, and that's what we're about to do right now. The first order of business is to tell the ECU that it has a wideband sensor. So down below on the ECU Inputs tab on the bottom menu, select the 5-volt input pin that you used. In my case, pin 4 is the front O2 sensor. After you've selected your input, click Save to ECU down in the bottom right corner. Now that the ECU has what it needs, let's configure the software to tell it where to look. We changed the pin assignment for the front O2 sensor from Factory None to LC1. I know it's an LC2 sensor, but the output voltages for both units are the same, and you should use LC1 for your LC2. Don't forget to save your pin assignment in the ECMlink software when you're finished. Ensure that your device is added to the list of captured values. It looks like mine's there already. That's interesting. It's pretty cool. Because I removed the factory O2 sensor, and I no longer have a narrowband signal to feed to my fuel routines, I need to simulate it. Hey, that's already set too. Check it out. Even more cool. Make sure your wideband switch point is set to 2.46 for the Innovate LC. That's also auto-filled as well. Man, they made this Jafro proof. Anyway, verify these fields and ensure they match your equipment. Useful links are in the description for those of you integrating your LC1 or LC2 with ECMlink. Now we're ready to fire this thing up. Let's add the wideband value to the logging window so that we can see what the wideband has to say to the ECU. And there you have it. There's the wideband in the logs. And there's the wideband gauge. Now I can see my fuel trims when the laptop's not hooked up to alert me of any problems while I get her dialed in. I can't cover the fuel tuning in this video because we're already coming up on 20 minutes and this is really a wrap. It works. You've seen it. Having a wideband oxygen sensor is the most accurate and ultimate means of keeping tabs on your fuel tuning. What I think is amazing about integrating a wideband sensor with ECMlink is you pretty much just need to hook up one wire differently, then pick it from pop-up menus, click 2 buttons and check a box. You don't even need to weld anything. The factory O2 sensor location works great. Suddenly you have a wideband signal and you're simulating your narrowband O2 sensor. If you use the fuel calculator and you set your global and your fuel trims and they're way too rich or way too lean, use your dead time to compensate for it at idle to bring the wideband signal closer to your stoichiometric fuel ratio. My STFTs are near 0 and that's good. I'm in closed loop idle. Long-term fuel trims are a bit off, but I can work on those a bit. Vacuum's reading about 13 to 14 inches of mercury at 800 RPMs. That's not great. That just screams vacuum leak. Even though I've got worn out rings and cams with a tight 103-degree lobe separation angle, I'd still like to see that up around 17 inches of mercury or so. Clearly I've got some bugs to work out. Some are mechanical, some are tuning related, but this is still a great start because I'm in closed loop idle now with all of my sensors working. Further evidence of a vacuum leak can be found by the difference between boost est, which is a calculation, and my Omni 4-bar readings. They're about 6 inches of mercury off from one another. But my ECU has the O2 signal it needs, and I'm getting great information from it where I need to go next. That's a huge step for this car, because if I can't do that, then nothing else in this ECU is worth tuning. This wideband installation with ECMlink served not only as a fix for my broken factory O2 sensor circuit, but as an upgrade for a more accurate means of monitoring my air-fuel ratio. The information it provides should help me extract every last bit of performance that I can from my speed density airflow metering system. Right now I have to pass my state inspection, and then I have some bugs to squash before it sees road and track time. I don't expect any problems with passing the state inspection because that's the last thing that it did immediately before I lost the #1 rod bearing. But I hope to bring you a video about my squashed bug collection soon so that we can get on to tuning and track videos as well as other projects. Like, share, and favorite if this helps you because it helps me too. And until the next episode, stay tubed.